Hallo, einen schönen Abend hier in Salzburg im Trakl-Haus anlässlich der Ausstellung von Kahane. In der Ankündigung stand, dass das Gespräch auf Deutsch stattfindet. Wir haben das jetzt aufgrund der Tatsache, dass die Sommerakademie international ist, umdisponiert und werden das Gespräch großteils auf Englisch führen. So, welcome, good evening in Salzburg, im Trakl-Haus. We will do the talk mostly in English, if that's okay with you. I'm very happy to be invited for this talk by Sophie. Thank you very much. This is a cooperation between the Summer Academy, where Leon is teaching a course at the moment in the lovely fortress. As I was thinking about this space, I have looked into, well, actually this I will do in German. So, wir sind ja hier im Trakl-Haus und ich habe schon wirklich sehr lange nicht mehr an Georg Trakl gedacht. Das ist ja ein Dichter, der sehr viel in der Schule gelesen wird. Und ich glaube, das ist auch das letzte Mal, dass ich etwas von Georg Trakl gelesen habe. So, for the international guest, Georg Trakl, who is the ghost of this house, is a poet who you read a lot in school. And he's kind of the, if you have these coordinates of his life, so he drank a bottle of wine in the morning and was in love with his sister, and then he died by overdose of cocaine. So it's like a blueprint for every artist's fantasy. The only difference is that this was in the context of the First World War. Otherwise, it would be like a Wanda hit or something. Ich habe an das Gedicht, an sein berühmtestes Gedicht gedacht, das wahrscheinlich sehr viele kennen. Es ist sein letztes Gedicht, das er 1914 vor seinem Tod geschrieben hat. Es heißt Grodek und handelt von der Schlacht, wo er als Sanitätsoffizier dabei war. Und das lese ich jetzt vor. Am Abend tönen die herbstlichen Wälder von tödlichen Waffen, die goldenen Ebenen und blauen Seen, darüber die Sonne düsterer hinrollt. Umfängt die Nacht sterbende Krieger, die wilde Klage ihrer zerbrochenen Münder. Doch stille sammelt im Weidengrund rotes Gewölk, darin ein zürnender Gott wohnt, das vergossene Blut sich. Mondene Kühle, alle Straßen münden in schwarze Verwesung. Unter goldenem Gezweig der Nacht und Sternen, es schwankt der Schwester Schatten durch den schweigenden Hain, zu grüßen die Geister der Helden, die blutenden Häupter, und leise tönen im Rohr die dunklen Flöten des Herbstes. O stolzere Trauer, ihr ehernen Altäre, die heiße Flamme des Geistes nährt heute ein gewaltiger Schmerz, die ungeborenen Enkel. I found an English translation of this poem for you on the internet, on the train, as I was changing the plans. So I'm not very good in English poetry, but I'll try my best. So Grodek is the name of the Polish town where this battle happened, that he was a medical assistant in the war and saw wounded soldiers killing themselves. And yeah. At evening, the autumnal forests resound with deadly weapons. The golden plains and blue lakes, above them the sun, rolls more darkly by. Night enfolds the dying warriors, the wild lament of their broken mouths. But in the grassy vale, the spilled blood, red clouds in which an angry god lives, gathers softly lunar coldness. All roads lead to black decay. Beneath the golden boughs of night and stars, the sister's shadow reels through the silent grave. To greet the ghosts of heroes, their bleeding heads, and the dark flutes of autumn sound softly in the reeds. O prouder sorrow, you brazen altars, today in immense anguish feeds the mind's hot flame, the unborn descendants. And the reason why I wanted to remember him is because he was one of the poets of modernism. So he kind of invented language in a different way, and he was using disharmonies a lot. This poem ends with the unborn heirs, what was the English word? Descendants, so the unborn grandchildren, which brings me to the exhibition of Leon, where this is a topic as a starting point for your work. So in the work that gave title to this show, you approached part of your family history in a place, Drancy, outside of Paris. I wonder how you would describe your perspective being a grandchild in approach to making this work. What is the...
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming. And it's great to have the opportunity. Thank you, Verena, for doing this. Verena and I are also long-term friends, and so it's very nice to have her here today. It's difficult. I mean, it's kind of obvious, of course, because autobiographical works, they are, I mean, usually for an artist, I would say, an easy target to approach this, and it's something that you see often, that artists are working on autobiographical issues. So I tried in this work to find some very general aspects and focus on them. I mean, in this case, what Verena refers to is my grandmother that I never met because she died in 1976 from cancer. She was a painter. She lived in the GDR. In the GDR, she was also like a known painter. After the wall went down, no one knew her anymore. But that's somehow a different story. It somehow relates to it, but it's somehow also a different aspect. She was a prisoner in this camp in Drancy. Drancy is a suburb of Paris, and It's a typical banlieue, and the camp that she has been in together with her brother is the most famous and was the biggest camp where people were from there they were brought to Auschwitz. Yeah, so she was there. She survived. She was liberated on the 18th of August 1944 when the camp was liberated. So I got into her drawings. I checked out some of her works. I saw drawings of children that have been in the camp. So, okay, this is a sad story. Maybe I should, today we always have these like trigger warnings, so it's a sad story. So the last deportations from Drancy to Auschwitz were just children, trains full of children, and she drew these children, and I must say, these drawings don't really speak to me at all, but from there I went on to research about this place itself and started to get into it. And what became very interesting to me is actually a certain aesthetical aspect of it, because Drancy, the place where the camp has been, was a modernist housing project. It was the most ambitious modernist housing project of that time in all Europe. It was extremely well received in Europe and in America. It was exhibited in the MoMA. It won prizes. Marcel Lotz was the architect. Jean Prouvé was the engineer. And before it was ever finished, it was almost finished, the Vichy regime, which collaborated with the National Socialists, took over the camp and decided to first transform, the housing complex, decided to transform it first in a prison and then into a camp because of its modernist or modern structure. It was very, let's say, easy to transform it into a camp. If you see other camps, you usually see that they have barracks that were specially built to have people in there, and you don't see old structures usually used as camps. So this was for me, a very strong image, and then I'm also done, for actually this like sad connection between modernism and an anti-modernist or anti-modern ideology that somehow also found a very practical way of using these modernist utopian ideas, architectures, and so on.
So the first time you were there, or correct me if I'm wrong, well, you started with this to work on this location in the work that is also shown here in a context Peachy Boy. So this was the first time you went to this place to make an artwork. Is that correct?
Yes, I was invited to show in Munich in the NS Documentation Center, which is not an art space, but a space which serves the documentation of the rise of the National Socialist Party. So this is the perspective of this place. It's not focusing on the victims of the Second World War, of the Shoah, but it serves to show how the National Socialist Party could actually rise to power. So it's it's a view that strongly focuses on these political aspects. And when I was invited, and since I'm dealing with these topics a lot, I thought I tried just like to bring in a different perspective into this place. So I thought this is the moment where actually I could make such a autobiographical work, which I usually don't necessarily do. And so I went there, and what I found was very interesting, because I found 2 memorial sites. I found an official documentation center that is part of the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris. It's it's basically representing the official memorial or memory politics of France concerning the Shoah. And I found a second one that is inside this former camp structure. Now this is run and has been built and set up by a group of survivors. So you have like 2 very, very different approaches. I don't want to say that one is like better or worse than the other one. It's just 2 different aspects. They both have their necessities, but they work, of course, a bit different. Now I must say that every part of this big modernist construction, or of this like whole complex of buildings is already like teared down. It doesn't exist anymore. Just the former camp exists. And in this place today is a social housing project, which is a very typical banlieue housing project with a very typical banlieue demographics. So most people that live there are in some way biographically connected to former French colonies, West Africa, North Africa, India. So these people don't necessarily have a strong connection to the former history of the place. So it somehow also represents a discourse, a discussion, and that we are having nowadays, currently, about how to go on with these different kinds of memories, with these different kinds of biographical backgrounds that now come together and somehow have to find a way to communicate in a certain way, or like translate each other to each other, or something like this. So, without judging this in any way, it's just like somehow a manifestation of discourses that we are, at least in Germany, like reading about every day in the newspapers. There you have this at a specific place. It's basically part of everyday life, and so this was very interesting for me. So
you can see that, for example, in the video.
Yeah.
Which point, you have this perspective of the narrator who's telling you about the place, and then you have on a different screen you have these little insert videos where you see, for example, I don't know, there's a scene where there's someone with these, I don't know what these machines are called, and that are blowing the leaves.
A leaf blower.
Yeah, and I mean that's I find that a very when I watch this video a very interesting way. I mean, it's also kind of funny because the way you film it, or the way this video is there, is kind of makes it look like really meaningless work also, like kind of, what, I mean, these machines are strange anyway, so I'm kind of, what I always find very interesting and successful in your works is how you use this kind of subtle, is this humor, and I find it very difficult with these topics to insert it. But I find that very hard. Would you say it's humorous? I mean,
it's not humorous, but it's just so. Yeah, you have this. You have this.
Or a kind of absurdity that kind of tells you about the usage of that place, contemporary usage, or.
Yeah, I mean, it's all absurd. Yes, of course it's absurd, and its normality in these places is absurd. It's just absolutely absurd. But of course, it happens. Like time creates, normalizes things, and people go on with their lives, and it's absolutely also necessary to somehow that a certain normalization takes place probably. But there are many very, very absurd aspects. For example, the narrator, the guy that I'm filming, and he was telling the story, he's a survivor. He survived because he was hidden by a Catholic family somewhere around Paris in the countryside. His mother was transported from Drancy to Auschwitz. His wife's father was transported from this place to Auschwitz, and his name is Lucien Tinader, his wife's name is Micheline Tinader. He worked all his life in this building because he had his, how do you call it, sweat? I mean, I think you don't call it sweatshop, but he was like a sewing, you know, like he had his workshop in this building. Coincidental. I mean, he had his workshop in the building where this camp was. And all his life means just a few years after the war was over. And then when he became a pensioner, he gave his space to a small foundation so that they have a space to create their own exhibition. So this is how this little exhibition by survivors actually came to life. And this is absurd. And then of course you see it's absurd it's somehow absurd how these places are being kept clean all the time. You know, of course there's a lot of pressure in this place. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of poverty and a lot of, you know, and still somehow they take care that this place looks perfectly nice, I would say, by daylight. So it's typical, I think, in the French banlieues. They look like in many parts, very nice. And there's a lot, you know, so they really take care of that. So there's like many gardeners and so on. There are like parrots living in there and so on. But I'm not trying to make a joke about it. It's just an observation, and it's just like to show, yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to show the normality, and it's weird how this place. There's the official French documentation center. It was newly built. It's a new architecture, new structure on the other side of this camp. It's like amazing. It's modern. It has like a mirroring facade. So I filmed in the mirror, and you see always this like camp, and and then you see the street in between. There are like people in traffic jam, and they're like bored, and I mean, it's just the mood. It's not, but it's not to make fun of it.
No, that's also not how I saw it. But what I find interesting is that it's not this usual way how to deal with this material, like. Memory and the kind of the conventions that go with it. As I mean, you're dealing with the display of memory, and I mean here in this room, the photographs that are installed on the, I would say, main material that we're going to address also are documentation photos of the exhibition that's done by the survivors. So they have a certain aesthetic that you document that we know from, how we would call it, it's not a high museum aesthetic. I in a text that I found about your work, when you received the Ars Viva Prize some years ago, the author Anna Pritzkau has a very nice description of one of your earlier works from 2015, Europa nach 1945, which deals with remembering. And there's a part, I will do this in German and then try to translate it. I find it very, very interesting that how she describes what you see in this video. I don't know if you want to, this is about the Germans and their history. And she describes it, your artwork like this. Menschen marschieren zwischen Exponaten, ein Mann steht vor einer Vitrine, der Kopf hängt ihm zu Boden. Andere fotografieren Fotografien, Wandtexte und Akten. Sie machen sich Notizen, sie machen Aufnahmen und Interviews. Die Gesichter, die sie tragen, sind alle gleich streng und gleich betroffen und doch gleich distanziert oder einfach nur hochprofessionell. Obwohl das Sichtfeld, das Kahanes Kamera den Zuschauerinnen ermöglicht, so breit ist, haben die Betrachterinnen von Europa nach 1945 nichts mit den Menschen in dem Film zu tun, nichts mit den Exponaten. Zwischen allem herrscht Distanz, zu allem herrscht Distanz. Das Ritual wird sichtbar, es ist das Deutschland im Jetzt, das choreografierte, wir müssen uns erinnern. Es nennt sich hier Vergangenheitsbewältigung und ist alles nur nicht persönlich. Denn man erinnert nur abstrakt, immer sind es nur Massen, an die man denkt, der man gedenkt, Massen von Nazis und Judenmassen. Erinnerung als höchste Form des Vergessens, so hat der Publizist Eike Geisel diesen Tanz einmal bezeichnet. Die Schritte sitzen perfekt, sie gehen im Alltag so. Stolpersteine putzen, am Holocaust-Mahnmal abhängen, Nico Hoffmann-Hits wie unsere Mütter, unsere Väter zu einem schönen Glas Rotwein anschauen. Und im Museum vor Tagebüchern toter Juden ein todbleiches Gesicht auflegen. Performt wird zu den deutsch dröhnenden nie wieder Rhythmen. So in this text, she describes how the ritual of memory as a visitor in Germany is choreographed, more or less. So I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but it has to deal with the distance that is between the spectator and the material, and I think this is something that you address in your work or deal with in a different way.
Yeah, maybe just for the context, it was a press tour of a show in the German History Museum in Berlin, Deutsches Historisches Museum, and it was a press tour through the show which was called Europe After 45, and it was a very weird show. It was still under the direction of the old director. I think it's much more interesting place now. And I filmed it with this kind of action camera and just filmed this whole, how these notes were made, and then in the end how this is creating this kind of circle of information. So this was it was a very performative moment, and I tried to support this aspect with this like action camera look.
Maybe we come to the main material of this show, which is Styrodur.
Yeah.
Platte, which is an insulation material. Maybe we want to tell us a little bit about how this came about.
Yeah, it's just, I was thinking, I mean, it was also related to the space itself, so it was pretty clear that we will not use the walls of the Trakl house to install the works, so I was thinking of a display, and then through the research I came across this Styrodur material, which is basically produced by the company BASF. BASF is a big company in Germany that produced chemical materials, and they were part of a holding that was called IG Farben. IG Farben also produced Zyklon B, and BASF actually was, or IG Farben, they were the only ones who actually had a labor camp that was connected to Auschwitz. So they had a labor camp next to Auschwitz. It was called Auschwitz III Monowitz, and there they basically produced a component that is called Styrox, and this is what has been and is, I guess, still used for these like Styrodur plates, and these Styrodur plates are being found, I mean, basically everywhere where you have to create a not too expensive isolation for buildings, for living spaces. So this is why we use this material, or why I use this material.
And it's a kind of, so what I found out about it is that it's a form of synthetic caoutchouc. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So the story is that the Germans wanted to be autark. They want so because caoutchouc has to be imported, no? And they wanted to not. So there was also some war.
They didn't want to rely on the imports and so on.
Yeah, and so they wanted to have a way to.
Yeah, of course, it's better to have to rely on forced labor than on like import. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what builds the display or the underlaying structure. Because it is a material that is underlaying some, like so many structures every day. We cannot see it, but it's like under many facades. And for me, this has a strong analogy of how continuities, on how many levels historical continuities can actually happen. So they can be in material, they can be in aesthetics itself, they can be in cultural codes, they can be in language, and so on and so forth. So this is just one aspect. And actually, I mean, if you do these kind of researches, especially when you talk about Germany and the Second World War, it's almost impossible to not find something interesting that's connected in these kind of ways. It's everywhere. And yeah, so this time it's this material, and yeah.
And the way you use it, so in the form of this display, it's very much reminds me of the kind of arsenal of display aesthetics. No, when I mean, since institutional critique in the 90s, when exposing structures became kind of big, and plywood was used and all these materials. So are you connecting to these discourses in a way that is also criticizing it or making it a topic? Because what I find is that in like institutional critique aesthetic, or in, I mean, when I studied sculptures, definitely this material was everywhere, like plywood, no? Like, because it's raw, but there was never any, I mean, this was like the cool 90s, I don't know, but there was not this level of, there was not so much attached to it. There was also a formalism that people indulge in, and this kind of the cheap material, but your work is very loaded, and also, I mean, I don't know how now, because insulation now with the ecological crisis has a different meaning, no? For it carries the material, how you use it, it carries with connected to the history, as we talked about it, also the notion of efficiency, Germans, the efficiency, you know, and nowadays I think insulation material with ecology, I mean, I tried to Google a little bit how this is advertised, this material now, and everything. And of course, everything is about the environment. You save the planet with this now, no? How do you think this these things, you know, with the kind of the way you here, if you come in here on the right, your installation, which is a steel construction, which is and has these plates serve as background material, so as a display. And the way the photographs are hung, is there a certain methodology? Do you have on the, so it shows the road around Drancy?
So yeah, two things. First, yes, it's true, of course. Nowadays, if you look at material like this, first thing that comes to mind is that it's not, let's say, eco-friendly at all. this is not the point in this work, and people might criticize it for using a material like this. The problem is, though, that it's still part of the history, so you cannot, I mean, I think it's important, even though, I mean, it's a very general thing to say, but of course, the history is not done yet. I mean, we're not done with the history, and you cannot now put it aside for, especially not symbolically, to make a point for a better future. But I would understand still a criticism like this if someone would say, yeah, but it's not eco-friendly. But it's still necessary to speak about it, so it has to be there. Maybe that's the point. The other thing is, when I photographed now, last time for this show in Drancy, I realized, I didn't know that before actually, that many streets around this camp are named after former because they died, most of them 1944, resistance fighters. From Drancy, they were all locals, they were like taxi drivers, policemen, shop owners, like regular people. There are streets named after the 8th of May 1945. These are all things in this kind of way that I don't know from Germany. There is like a memory to like people that are important and so on and so forth, but not on this personal, local, quote unquote, unimportant level. That like a regular person, it is worth to remember because he was part of the active resistance and he had to die for it, because they all died for it. So some died in camps in Germany, in Sachsenhausen next to Berlin. Some others died, for example, in Sachsenhausen, others died in other places, others were shot in street fights, others were assassinated symbolically on places and so on and so forth. So this is something that I don't know, and it also shows a difference, how the approach is different. The German approach to memorial culture is different because they cannot, it always conflicts with the personal histories of the people that still live in Germany, of course, and there are some taboos. You cannot go there. So no matter what I think about communism, remembering a local that was a communist by naming a street after this person is an absolute no-go. It will not happen. In Paris, you have places that are called Stalingrad Place. Unthinkable in Germany, it will not happen. As I said, it doesn't matter what I think about Stalin or communism. It's like, so, as a reminder of the time, it's unthinkable because of certain anti-communist sentiments that are not just critical of communism, but this is about something else. Anti-communism, like anti-modernism, is not critique of the critical aspects of modernity. Anti-modernism is something different. And this is the point here. And of course, on the other hand, France has its own history and its own parts where they will not go. And it would be easier for Germany to address this. So there's also like a little battle going on here, right? So there are so many levels and layers of abuse, of political game and gamble all the time. But for me personally, these are cultural questions. And I see this all the time now, especially. For example, in Germany, there's like a big debate now about how to bring together the memory of the Shoah and colonialism. And it's loaded with so much on every level, with so much abuse and instrumentalization that I find it sometimes almost unbearable. Even if there are critical aspects, but these critical aspects, I think they actually develop with this like abusive aspects. This is, when it becomes a political tool and you lose the connection to the cultural questions of it, where it comes from and how it could develop. And this is actually what I try with these different layers of materials, of displays, of photographs, of here, what you said, that like, even the name, Pichipoi, the name of the video, that's not an it's named after a place they called Pichipoi, these survivors, or also the people who didn't survive. They didn't know what Auschwitz is, so they made up the word Pichipoi. They didn't know. It's an imaginary place, but they know it's a horrible place, but they gave it almost a childlike name. This was the place they are going to. So I tried to include all these little things, aspects, some things more documentary, some less, but I want to be in control of every detail. And when you talk about display, for example, just as like a way to put history on, to display history or to display culture or something, this is what I find a bit problematic actually, because I think the display itself represents also a bit the perspective of who actually shows what's going on. And here, of course, I'm not an employee of BASF, and I do not agree with this, but it is, from my perspective, an important aspect of it. So somehow I have to go into this, and I even have to show something that I find disgusting. But I somehow have to, so I include it somehow.
Yeah, for me it has the aesthetic, if you come in, it's quite heavy and harsh. It's not this feel-good display that we all like, because it has a pedagogical feeling, and I don't know, there's something, and especially find, I mean, you used these plates also as sockets, so it's not also display installation, it's also sculpture. The video Pichipoi is shown on these.
It's like a sideboard almost.
Yeah, yes, and also corresponds in a formal way to, I think, which is one of your best works, which is also on the show here, called Jerry Cans, To Can Jerry, which is a video work shown on canisters socket. Maybe you want to say shortly something about this work?
Here we can say the object itself, the jerry can, is actually what the whole story is about. So the jerry can.
It's a gasoline.
It's a gasoline can. It's a canister. It was invented by the Germans. It was invented for the war machinery of the Second World War, and it wasn't invented but produced as a mass product with forced labor by a company called Max Bose Car Components. They are in Coburg. And in the video you see an animated comic-like canister who tells in the style of a Zeitzeuge, of like a witness, time witness, tells his story as an object. And the story is interesting on many levels. First of all, because it was such a successful German product that is being used until today and produced until today.
And maybe you can, the title shortly, so Jerry was the...
Yeah, Jerry was the name that the British gave the Germans. They called them the Jerrys. And there was a British propaganda film that is also included in this work. It's called Jerry Can, the German canister. Jerry Can, To Can Jerry. To can Jerry, so like to destroy them basically. Because the British used this canister in the end. Oh, thank you. They stole the product, rebuilt it, and used it because they had a shitty canister. It was called the Flimsy. It lost almost 2/3 of gasoline because it was so ineffective. And this company is in Coburg. Coburg was the first Nazi city of Germany. They were like strong believers in the cause. And Max Bose was also the guy who was running this company. He was also a strong believer. And due to having this like mass product, he also qualified for the so-called Persilschein, which was given out. It was called Persil, like this washing powder, which was given out by the Americans when they didn't find too much evidence of war atrocities. They would say, okay, you're clean, you're washed clean, you can go on producing after Second World War. So because they became so big, with the help of forced labor, they actually could stay in business. And today, the company is run by the grandson of Max Brose. His name is Michael Stoschek, and he actually had a historian write a book about the family, autobiography or biography, or family biography, which has no quotes at all, no sources. It's a completely made-up story. And in 2015, he actually managed to force the city of Coburg to rename a street after Max Brose, who was he was one of the first NSDAP members. He was a Nazi, he was an anti-Semite, and he managed by force to do that. The street goes along the former synagogue, which is no synagogue anymore because you don't have a mentionable Jewish community anymore in Coburg. And I came across this work, or I developed this work because I was invited to make a show in a very small space next to the collection of Julia Stoschek, who is the daughter of Michael Stoschek, and who has one of the most important art collections. And I mean, she makes a lot of, she has amazing works by amazing artists, and it's really also not the fault of the artists, but because she also doesn't address the story, and she profits of it because it's all bought with the money of the company, and she's also in the board, and she's head of the company, and she's working for the company, and so on and so forth. She never really addressed this very special approach. I mean, many companies have this history, but some deal with it. I mean, the family paid some money, but just to, have no problems at all, but they didn't address it in a way that I find much more important, enlightening the history, giving out the names of the former forced labor people, all these biographies that they destroyed. The people are living somewhere, the relevance, and they don't care at all. And so it was a slight scandal, a bit. I think in the art world, it was during the gallery weekend, and there was a lot of rumors, and people were nervous about it. Nothing really changed. I mean, the collection now has a little note on their website. Of course, the note reads a little bit like this family biography. I mean, it's a joke. But so this is what the work is about. Mm-hmm. But it is also, I must say, it's not the work itself, it's not like a work that accuses her. The name doesn't even come up at all. It's a work that has also some optimism in the end, because the canister was actually used in the end to fight the Nazis. So there is a chance. It's not that there is no possibilities, or that everything is over, or that you have to be go into fatalistic ideas, but there's a chance. So I want to leave this window open, and I want to make this point. And
I find it also formally. I love this work. It's these shiny canisters, and then there's a screen, and you have this animation, which you have a kind of insert of the canister, like a product video, with this very shiny aesthetic, of since
it's post 3D.
Yeah, 3D since post-internet art, when being contemporary means that you're using all these shiny materials and all the, I don't know. I mean, I was in the 2015 New Museum Triennial, curated by Ryan Trecartin, and where this was the height of that, washing machine surfaces and cars. And what I find interesting is that you use this, and then you have almost like I mean, I read it a little bit like, oh, you are the Zeitzeuge, I'm the old guy with the gray hair, still addressing these topics, and I find it also a very nice symbol of these, you know, these canisters as a socket. That's us in the contemporary art world, kind of. We're running on this fuel of still, you know, unaddressed. Where does the money come from that is fueling all of our cool activities? You know, like find that very. I mean, this 4-minute video is a hit, I think. Yeah. No, I mean, it works like it's very.
Yeah, I mean the comic itself, of course, there are many. There are like basically 3 different aesthetics in the video. You have the propaganda film, which is of course looks nice, looks great. Jerry can to Ken Jerry. The canister talks about how they made a propaganda movie about him and how he became a star. So he tells about the movie they made about him, and so you have this look. And the comic itself looks a bit like these didactic, also propagandistic comics of this time. They used to produce a lot of comic materials to like somehow get people involved in all these like topics, the war and so on. And then you have, of course, this like shiny, so it's all very attractive visually, not like the, you know, not like some other parts of this show. But this is, yeah, it has, all of these looks are somehow very strong representatives of convincing imagery, let's say it like this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a level in your work. The art that is educational. I mean, that's the reason I brought the Trakl poem is not just for posing, but also because it's an example that is used in school to how you learn about the war, yeah, through means of art, and I think I mean, what I'm reminded of is that it's kind of important to put these topics into a museum, because probably if they are art, they get taken care of more or something. I don't know. That's just a thought I had, but I mean, it's something. How is it? Yeah, like the level of documentation and the aesthetic. I mean, you deal a lot with that.
It's. I think, from my perspective, I would say that culture plays an extremely important role, and I mean it in the broader sense, but I mean it also in the sense of like art, really art, painting, like, and of course literature as well, but also especially art. It used to, and it still does, serve an extremely important, or has an extremely important role to legitimize certain certain perspectives on things. You need the, I mean, you know, so I think the art world itself has to deal with this much more. Not just like pointing this out all the time, but also self-reflecting. And I think it's, anyway, the strongest engine for successful artworks is self-reflection. Yeah, so I think art in itself is very complicit. We learn about this nowadays. I mean, at least if we talk about 20th century in Europe or in Germany, let's reduce it to Germany. We learn this more and more, right? We learn now about the Documenta. We learn about Joseph Beuys. We learn about all these aspects where you can see how art has been complicit or has been made complicit in producing images in the broader sense, self-images that were used to have a relief from this history, from this horrible history of like not only one world war, but 2 world wars, and all kinds of things. I mean, in other European countries, you have other topics that are more important, that are more focused on colonialism, that is not the main focus in Germany. We're focusing more on the Shoah. And when we talk about, for example, the Documenta and Joseph Beuys, then this also plays a bigger role. This is actually what also for them it was all about. So this is the big stain here. And if you go into this, if you dig deeper, if you look into concepts of identity in Martin Heidegger's work, then you don't need to understand in 2015 his like black notes, or what it's called in English, that he was an anti-Semite. You could know that before, and most people did, but it was debated. Or if you think about Wagner, and the question.
Let's open a.
Or if you think, you know, all these kind of things, it's all there. It always has been there, and it is always. It has been gaslighted away. Mm-hmm. You know, yeah. and always the argument always comes through culture. Mm. This is the point where the argument becomes strong. And when we look now at our political landscape nowadays, since 2005, I would say, since Angela Merkel said these magical words, we will do it, we will make it, when she talked about refugees coming to Europe, coming to Germany, coming to Europe. Since then, the argument with culture was getting bigger, bigger, and bigger. You know, before, but like, it started with the rise of the AfD and so on in Germany. But now we just talk about culture. We talk all the time about culture, we talk all the time about identity, for good reasons. But I think it shows how strong the impact of these arguments are, because they leave the political debate and also logic and rationality. They become emotional, and this is when it becomes very also dangerous somehow, but when it also goes like very deep. If you go into the like, it's like going and hacking into the system. Mm-hmm. You're not using just like the desktop and so on, you're hacking into the system. And that's, and I think it will be more also in the future. And yeah.
Yeah, I hear the bells. I don't know how we are with the time, but perhaps there's some room for questions from the audience, or invitation for more discussion. Or comments.
Well, maybe just as the second part of the exhibition was an invitation to the Forum for Democratic Art and Culture, I think maybe it's interesting to elaborate a little bit of that motivation behind it, in the way of where you then would place the cultural question in such an activity.
Yeah, so Forum Democratic Art, Forum Democratic Culture Contemporary Art. Exactly, that's what it's called. A friend of mine, Fabian Bechtle, and I founded it in 2018 because we wanted to have a space where we can actually debate all these topics on a scale that we can work in two directions. First of all, show in political context, political activist context, the relevance of art as a project, as like a field which has a big potential for projections and argumentation in politics, and on the other hand to make in the field of art the point a bit more, or like stress the point more, that we have to talk about the use and abuse of art and culture for politics. So it goes in two directions. We are collaborating with a lot of historians, researchers, activists, maybe also, political scientists, and so on and so on. And what we did, for example, is we have like podium discussions, Berliner Volksbühne. This was about continuities of anti-Semitism. We had, for Hito Steyer's show in the K21 or K21 in Düsseldorf, we produced 14 videos. You can see 3 of them here. That were, so first of all, we came up with 14 categories that we were connected loosely to the F scala, the fascism scale of Adorno. And we came up with names like, or categories like German cultural mediation, and the scale for it was by Heidegger translations. And then we made a video about Martin Heidegger and his ideas of identity. Or we made a video about, that's why I mentioned it before, Wagner, but we used Wagner to get deeper into the question of, in German we say Trennung Werk und Autor, like can the division, is there a possible division between a body of work and its author? So, and we discuss this in the text and then we make this video. And the third one we are showing here is, it's about also propaganda film, which is very funny. It was made to prove that the Germans, like the old Germans, were actually building the pyramids. They were actually the ones who were building the pyramids, which no one knows today. So, and we always had like a quite humoristic approach in most of the videos, not in all of them, but in some. For example, in this propaganda video, we wrote a text, we wrote a dialogue, and we dubbed over the figures that are like, there's a little fight in this video where 2 people are like discussing. And it's actually an interesting discussion because it's a person who believes in facts, a historian, and another one who tries to promote a cultish German, like old German, Germanisch idea, like a conspiracy, basically. And this is like at a time where somehow not everyone was yet convinced by these like conspiracy narratives. And we are also nowadays, we're like living in a time where like these conspiracy narratives are taking a lot of space in public debate, where everyone has to react to, media has to react to it. We have fact finders, fact checkers everywhere. It's a big problem, you know. Also here, it of course is strongly connected to many ideas that come from, for example, postmodernist thinkers. I mean, it's not their fault, but I mean, it can be used, it can be abused for this idea. Why should Donald Trump, why shouldn't he say there is no truth? When we are in many, in like some postmodernist spheres, debate the existence of truth. Why shouldn't you also debate the existence of truth and say it's an alternative fact? I mean, it's as easy as, you know, like it's simplified, but of course you can make easy use of it. It's like in judo, you know. You just, you use the energy of them and you flip it in a different direction. And so yeah, in this room, here we are showing 3 of these videos, and we will have some debates with a historian next week, Robert Obermeier. He's from Salzburg. He will talk about street names and so on in Salzburg. Like, I mean, critically, critical street names, not any street names. It will not be about the Mozart place. And we will have some students, a student and an artist, who are very active in addressing the Luega statue in Vienna, which is also highly debated because Luega was also a known anti-Semite and influencer for Adolf Hitler. So yeah.
Yes, we have an influencer statue in Vienna.
Yeah.
Yes, so these events can be found on the invitation and on the website. That's happening. Are there any other comments or questions? Raka?
There's a microphone.
I owe you a question, since I was pushing you to turn into English. So thank you for that. No, I'm really curious. There were many interesting things you said in between. But what I'm curious is about your practice. Do you have any kind of ethical boundaries where you kind of put in front of you and you say, this, I don't want to do it. If I do it this way, you know, like aesthetically or technically or content-wise, because you said you don't want to deal with biography and stuff, you know, it's not so often that you do that. When you do it, what makes you know, what are the boundaries, or do you have any conflictual zone where you feel like that's how far you can go because of these reasons?
No, I think the boundary is ethical. I mean, I have many, for sure. I do not want to create scandal. I mean, you know, I don't want to scandalize things. That's why I made the point with the canister. It's not a work that scandalizes. It's just that it needs to, that there is like a structural issue and it needs to be addressed. And I think in the end, and that's what I learned from German memorial culture, always when you push, for example, in this case, a company into this direction, and they somehow give in, let's say, like a couple of years later, they will be the first ones who will be like, yeah, and we dealt with our history, and we're the greatest. So, you know, like in the end, everyone is proud. What I meant with the biographical thing is, I think it's very, very tricky, because of course, everyone has the biographical issues and they relate to many, many aspects, and they create the perspective, and they create, let's say, a personal kind of culture that we develop in ourselves, how we see things and so on. But I don't want to use it, for example, with my grandmother, I often also even don't say where this now comes from. I mean, in one show it was visible, but here it's not at all. And you can read it in one text, but just because I do not like, in this case, let's say, these determined aspects of identity, she's my grandmother, as an argument. I don't like that. I don't like identity as an argument. I like it as a way to look at cultural questions and to create culture, but I also like to emancipate from that. I think that's actually important. I mean, I said that, let's say it like this. In Judaism, the whole idea is identity is not an argument. Identity is what you emancipate from to create, in this process, create an idea of culture. That doesn't mean that identity doesn't exist. That also doesn't mean that like many aspects of identity are determined and they create, again, experiences that become part of the process of developing culture. But I don't like it in itself as an argument saying, my grandmother was in the French resistance. You know, like, she was. I'm very proud of that. I'm very happy, but I know also it could also be different. It could also be that she would have been complicit in a very bad system. And also, by the way, with my grandparents, even though they have this like glamorous biographies, I do not agree with everything they did and said, because they were also in like situations in double binds as going as Jews from the resistance to the GDR, somehow working there in socialism, and these also created different problems. They also had to somehow create a narrative to make this that was not just true, that was not completely enlightened or, you know, or aware of everything, but it was necessary to somehow make it all bearable. You know, like this situation being in Germany again, and they made this decision for some certain reason, you know, so like all these things, there's like, Yeah, so I think I have a lot of moral and ethnic boundaries. And also it creates sometimes fear, you know, what to say, what not to say. You know, sometimes I feel things, they make me angry and I know I shouldn't do, and it creates somehow a conflict. So I try to stay with, keep the feeling at one point. But yeah, but I think identity as an argument, that's the thing. I don't like that.
It's a nice mic, you can try it.
Yeah, try it out.
Really?
Thank you for the talk until now and the questions and so on. I just wanted to, I don't know, but when you say you don't like identity as an argument, I have like in my head, and there are a lot of things that pop up. And in case of your example, I do totally understand it. But of course, there are a lot of other examples where I don't know. You have a lot like where questions pop up like, can a white person address black problems, or can someone appropriate the history of other people or of another culture? So, and these are all identity problems that are kind of connected to this big sentence of saying one does not like identity-based work. If I understood that, if I understood that correctly.
No, I said that there are many aspects of identity that create also I mean, I said it, of course, in a very, now, like, you know, you can write a book about it in the end, you know. But identity, first of all, I think that there's a big misunderstanding between, like, I think in many discourses we talk a lot about identity, we actually mean culture. That's one thing. Or there's like a lot of not clearness about what identity might mean and how this term has often been used and how it's been used as an argument when identity becomes an argument, especially in Germany. I can just talk about, I mean, I'm talking now a bit maybe in this context from my own perspective or like my own experiences. But as I also said, there are a lot of experiences that people make that are based on aspects that are determined and that are identity and that you cannot change. And these experiences also, of course, they transform into cultural tools, into language, into emotions, into all kinds of things. I would not, when I say identity is not an argument, that doesn't mean that I would say I speak as someone who I'm not, as a woman. I would not do this, you know. And I understand if someone says me as a woman, as much as I understand me as a Jew. If, as Anna Arendt said, if someone speaks to me as a Jew, I answer as a Jew. But the argument, like a cultural argument or an intellectual argument, to base it on this, you know, I do not agree with this. Like, it's not, to me, it is a form of regression. It's a regression to lean back and to argue with one's own identity. That doesn't mean that you cannot argue with your experiences and put all aspects of that together. But what people, for example, in the National Socialism did, they argued with identity. They argued on the base of blood and soil. This was the argument. So, and this was it's not just this and this. It is.
You can turn the question of identity.
Yeah, but you know that it's really, I think it's really important that arguing with identity is what makes identity, let's say, we call this word all the time, identity politics, into, from my perspective and from my experience, into identitarian politics. This is when you leave, it doesn't mean that you should not talk about all these questions, but as an argument.
I think it's some kind of start in order to pinpoint at certain things that are really political and that need to change, and that are often that concern often minorities, that need kind of a safe space or something where they can say, but we exist, or we...
But I'm not arguing with this.
I know, that's why I meant so and so, because this question of identity is, like, of course in your work very clear how you mean it, but when, like, a sentence, like you said it with the, I don't like work that is based on identity, then it's like also, you can put this sentence also in this other kind of context, and that's why I was kind of asking.
No, I just said, what I said, yeah, no, I don't like, this was about autobiographical aspects, and I just say that that's not, it must include the cultural transformations of it. Because in the end, I think it is more about culture, as I said, culture is the emancipation from identity. And that doesn't mean that the other thing doesn't count anymore. But I think it's for everyone. It's also as a Jew, Like, there is a very, to me, that's how I see it. And of course, it's also my own cultural experience, because it's so deeply in this whole Jewish idea, of course, it's a very important aspect of it. But it doesn't mean that I or other Jews wouldn't speak as one,
But what you're saying is, like, I as a Jew, it's not enough if I only use that as an argument to start and finish it. Maybe that's, if I can understand right. So it is more. It takes more than that.
Yes, I think it takes more than that. I think it takes more than that. I think for me it's very important to think about what that actually means, and what it means for culture.
Can be a starting point, but it shouldn't be the ending.
Yeah. As I said, like, there is a certain, like in psychology, when there is a regressive dynamic, in psychology, we go back to, there's like a certain idea of a rollback, and it becomes more simple. In the end, it's like just we go into a state of a stubbornness or childishness or whatever. And I think it's a bit this, that the more and more in Germany, in its history, the argument of identity, which is often delivered as culture, as it's often like named culture, but they talk about identity, and that's problematic, and it's also what they
when also it can be exoticized if it just
can also
used
be
in that way, right?
And also it can also be like very patronizing. It can be, I think, it can, also as a Jew, you can you make the experience that it can be extremely patronizing when people argue with what they think is your identity. So, and in the end, they talk about themselves. They just talk about themselves, and you have to be their projection, but they talk about their own questions of identity. And then they really mean identity. And then I think, shut the fuck up. You know? That's the moment where I think like, okay, whatever.
Was that the final word, or shut the fuck up? It's a pretty good final word, shut the fuck up, or I don't know.
I didn't say that so long.
No.
I actually said it in the morning because I came by a anti-corona little stand, and there was a guy, he wanted to give me his flyer.
You were not interested in what it said?
I was not very interested. It was like, who really profits from the mask terror?
Yeah, I would have would know
Shut the fuck
like
up.
to know the answer to that. We all know the answer to that.
Yeah.
The Jews. Any more questions? No? So I think we'll end here. Thank you very much for coming. And
Thank you very much for coming.
thank you. And yes, there will be an opening on the 24th of Rosella Biscotti in the Stadtgalerie. And the other program talks for this exhibition you can find online. And yes, so thank you.